Okay, now with all this nationalism and unification and imperialism dominating this period, you bet your sweet bippy that the art of this time is going to reflect and respond to it. So let's get romantic and talk about how Romanticism responded to the developments of the age. If you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Now, we talked about the emergence of Romanticism way back in Unit 5, but in this period it's going to come into its full flower. Remember that we talked about how Romantic artists rejected the cold rationality of Enlightenment thinking while simultaneously rejecting the calculated precision of neoclassical forms of art. Instead, Romanticism prized the raw emotion and subjectivity as a higher subject of artistic expression. And in breaking with these older forms of art, Romantic artists emphasized 6 themes as central to their art form. The first emphasis was emotion. And that way you could see a fresh exuberance in their works that defied the cold, hard, predictable lines enjoyed by neoclassical art. For example, here's Eugene Delacroix's Christ on the Sea of Galilee. You can see that Delacroix is trading the almost photorealistic precision of neoclassicism and tries to convey the emotion of the scene instead. The second romantic emphasis was on nature. One of the most famous landscape painters of this time was Caspar David Friedrich, and here you can see his seashore by moonlight and you can almost feel the weight of those clouds on your shoulders. The third romantic emphasis was on individuality, and again, let's consider Friedrich's painting Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. The lone wanderer looks upon the vast foggy landscape and seems to us to be equal to its demands. The fourth emphasis of romantic art was intuition. This was the idea that a human being can understand the world immediately without first reasoning it out. You can see this in lots of artists, but I'll focus on the poet William Wordsworth. His poetry is an ode to the glory hidden in everyday objects like a meadow or a path or a wildflower or a cliff edge. If reading his poetry, you get the sense that the intuitive understanding of the world is far grander than the analytical understanding of the world. The fifth emphasis of romantic art was the supernatural. The poet William Blake devoted nearly all of his poetic work to trying to plumb the depths of heaven and hell, and he did not do it in the image of the analytical thinkers like John Calvin or the Puritans, but rather with an emphasis on the feeling of faith. And the sixth emphasis of romantic art was national history. Now, not all romantic artists portrayed these themes, but there were some deeply inspired by a nationalist sentiment and sought to portray their national histories in terms of emotion and intuition. For example, Francisco Goya's The Third of May depicts Spanish rebels being executed by French forces in their conflict with Napoleon. And this is a good example not only of a highly charged emotional scene, but also romantic artists using their craft for the sake of glorifying their national history. Or you had the Russian composer Pyotr Tchaikovsky, who wrote symphonies and ballets with interweaving harmonies and great variations of pitch and volume, which had a way of increasing the emotional experience of his audience. One of his more famous pieces is the 1812 Overture, which was written to glorify the Russians who had successfully held off Napoleon from his invasion in Russia. However, by the second half of the 19th century, a new art form known as Realism came to dominate the landscape, though there is much overlap between it and Romanticism. Realist artists sought to portray the world as it was, and more specifically, the world of everyday people as it was. And as the realist moniker suggests, they wanted to portray those scenes as realistically as possible, which was a kind of rejection of Romanticism's emphasis on portraying the world through the lens of emotion. This movement was begun and led by the French painter Gustave Courbet. Here's his painting titled The Stone Breakers, and you know, it's a couple of guys breaking stones. So ordinary. There was also the French painter Jean-Francois Millet, whose painting The Gleaners portrays French peasants at their work, but simultaneously, by choosing them as the object of his work, dignified their work in a way that wider society did not. And writers also got in on the realism party, and you should know a couple of them. The French writer Honoré de Balzac essentially paved the way for the modern novel. His characters, even his minor characters, were both common and complex. And his work influenced the English novelist Charles Dickens, who took as the subject of many of his stories and novels the peasantry and the working class. And taken as a whole, Dickens's world can be seen as a critique of the Industrial Revolution's environmental and social degradation. Now, Romanticism and Realism gave way to the modern art movement around the turn of the century. As the technology of photography was gaining widespread use, painters no longer felt the need to produce their subjects in realistic fashion, but instead shifted more to abstract, subjective interpretations of their subjects. You can see that pendulum is always swinging back and forth. Around the late 19th century, Impressionism began to emerge. This style majored on light and color as the major subjects of its work. Claude Monet's Haystacks is a marvelous example. You can see that the realism has disappeared, and instead of having a clear sight of the landscape, you have a more emotional response to it, or one might say an impression of it. And then came a reaction to Impressionism, namely Post-Impressionism. And there was some overlap between the two stylistically, but Post-Impressionist artists moved toward a more symbolic use of color and light. The father of this movement was Paul Cézanne, and you can see these emphases in his painting called Portrait of Ambrose Vollard. Under the same heading, Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night is probably one you've seen. This is in no way an accurate representation of the scene, but you can feel the movement and the awe it provokes, despite the colors and lines being entirely unrealistic. But then around the turn of the 20th century, a new form of art arose called Cubism. In this movement, the subject of the paintings became almost nonsensical. It was a style that depicted three-dimensional objects in two dimensions. And Pablo Picasso is the most famous of these artists, and here you can see his painting Woman with a Mustard Pot. And you can clearly see that we are getting farther and farther away from the photorealistic paintings of the realists. Okay, if you want, click right here and grab my AP Euro review pack, since we're at the end of a unit and you are likely studying for a test. It'll give you everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. Or click here to review all of Unit 7 for AP Euro here on YouTube. Thanks for coming along. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.